Wie geht's? Kultur in Zeiten des Coronavirus. Hello everybody, it's been a while since our last English edition. Hello everybody, it's been a while since our last English edition of Wie geht's? A podcast of conversations with people working in the arts, cultural policy and the creative sector, reflecting on how the coronavirus crisis affects the cultural sphere. Here we are back again with another international episode of this podcast. My name is Martin Zierold. I'm the director of the Institute for Arts and Media Management at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Hamburg, Germany, which is producing this podcast. Today, I will be talking to Sue Kay, a dear colleague of mine with many talents and vast expertise in arts management and cultural leadership. As Sue is working as a freelance educator, trainer and researcher internationally, we will reflect on the situation of freelancers in our field. But our main focus is the more general question what the current conjuncture means for the cultural sphere, cultural management and specifically leadership. We will talk about how cultural management training is already changing and should be changing, how we can best support cultural managers and, quite importantly, how suddenly we become to realize that we find expertise in areas and people who quite often are on the fringes of our Western perspectives. The title of this podcast, Wie geht's, has a double meaning. It translates simply as how are you? We want to know how people in the arts are doing during these extraordinary and challenging times. Yet, Wie geht's also means how does it work? On this podcast, we hope to share fresh ideas, learnings, stories, how we rethink our practices and our role for societies as we try to come to grips with this crisis. My guest today, Sue Kay, has over 30 years of experience in arts management and cultural administration within performing arts organizations, funding bodies, development agencies, and higher education. She's worked as a producer, programmer, venue manager, planner, project coordinator, senior lecturer for cultural management, and now operates as a freelance consultant, educator, and trainer. Her most recent substantive post as Executive Director of Culture Southwest in the UK enabled her to focus on regional cultural development, capacity building, and high-level advocacy and facilitation. She has a particular interest in cross-sectoral working, organizational development, and curriculum design and delivery in the cultural management field. Sue Kay has an MA in Arts Management from City University in London and a PhD in Leadership Studies, focusing on the day-to-day activities of managers in small-scale theatre organizations. While she is now resident in France, she works mainly in Central and Eastern Europe, the Southern Mediterranean region, and Nordic Baltic countries. So I'm online with Sue Kay via Skype. And there's a lot of topics that we're going to be able to talk about. The situation of freelancers in Britain, questions of cultural leadership, questions of how adult learning and development can work in these circumstances. But the first question in this podcast is always very general and very brief. In German, I would ask, Wie geht's? In English, it's actually, how are you?
Yes, and I suppose if I was doing the usual British thing, I would just say fine and then expect us to move on to something else. So I won't do that this time. I am. There is a kind of a residual level of anxiety which I feel all the time. That's partly because we're in a situation of real uncertainty. Also because I don't live in the UK, I live in France. So I'm at a significant geographical distance from my family and a lot of my friends. I mean, that doesn't apply to friends here, but so I'm aware of that distance, and I think that to some degree that kind of feeds the residual anxiety that I'm feeling. I am trying to get to grips with the fact that I am not busy all of the time, and how to be with that, which is a very unusual experience. And I have found myself doing things like scheduling my day. So there's a bit of me that is still, it's not pretending I'm still working all the time, but it is scheduling my day so that I have a mix of activities. So, for example, my kitchen cupboards have never been cleaner. I have cleaned the oven, which was a major exercise. I'm cooking more. I'm reading more, and I'm slowing down. And so I can spend longer on particular things because I don't have the same kinds of imperative as I'm used to having. And at the same time, I'm feeling more tired, which is really weird, to kind of be doing things more slowly and then feeling really very tired, which is probably far more associated with the anxiety, I think, about everything that's going on. And I'm spending a lot of time thinking. About what's happening and what the implications of all of this are going to be. And I'm spending lots of time reading about all of that.
Maybe thinking is also making as part of the tiredness.
Yes.
Yeah, because thinking is exhausting in a way. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Before we turn to the topics you're thinking about, you mentioned you're living in France, and we hear about France and Germany, obviously, and the situation there being quite difficult also in terms of public health and quite strict regulations on free movement and all of these things, maybe even more so than in Germany right now. So just as a brief impression, how does public life feel like right now in the area where you are?
Well, I'm in the Corrèze region, which is quite rural. And I live in a small, well, I suppose it would be classified as a village, but it's called a medieval city here. And the population is about 1,300 people. Public life now really focuses on kind of day-to-day things like shopping for food. And because all of the little shops are still open and the supermarket that we have is still open, and people are keeping to the kind of 2-meter distance from each other. So if you go to the chemists, for example, it's set out with marks on the floor so that you keep your distance from the people in front of you. Everybody is being very respectful. Quite a lot of people are wearing masks. People are in the supermarket with gloves on. And it's quite calm, but that's because I think partly because there aren't that many of us here. So we're never really in a situation of being crowded. And public life is also curtailed because we have to have a thing that's called an attestation to leave the house. And there are 7 purposes for which we can leave the house, which include shopping or caring for relatives or people who are in difficulty or medical appointments, that kind of thing. And that's a bit strange for me as a Brit living here, because I couldn't imagine such a thing working at home. But I've kind of got used to it. We all just do it automatically now, where we take our attestation out with us, because if you go out without one and you get stopped by the police, then you can be fined. So there's a lot of self-policing going on in the absence of a police force. I mean, we have a couple of policemen here, but really not more than that. So public life is curtailed, I would say. We can't do the lots of things that are kind of bread and butter activities here, like eating and drinking out, because that's a big part of the culture here, and we can't do that. But we can still walk. We can still go out walking, which is good.
Yeah, and it's going to be an interesting question how the self-policing will maybe continue or stop after the official regulations have ended. But maybe before we go into deeper into that, let's look at the cultural sector and life in the cultural sector. You're living in a rural area, but you're very connected, and you work internationally in the UK, but also in various parts of Europe, Northern Africa. So what are you hearing from your peers, from your networks? How is the situation live, particularly for the freelancers around? Must be a very difficult situation. So what are the communities you're working with right now, or you're hearing from, and how are they doing?
I'll tell you one thing that's been really interesting. I think this is answering your question, but it's doing it kind of indirectly. Shortly after we went into lockdown in France, I was speaking to a friend and a colleague who was based in Bethlehem in Palestine. And she was being very ironic with me. And what she said was, now you in the West, you will understand what lockdown feels like. You may be struggling because you've been doing this for a couple of weeks. You try doing this for several years, and for once, we have got knowledge which you need, which is how you live with this. And it's obviously it's not solely in areas like Palestine, but elsewhere. And the other really interesting thing is that for freelancers, you do a lot of preparatory work normally on your own, or you might do that with one other person if you're working with them. And I was reading some things the other day by disabled practitioners. So one was a musician, another one is a theatre producer. And what they were saying was very interesting as well, which is we know about isolation. And maybe this is a set of circumstances where, again, the tables are turned. We have expertise in doing this because we live it. So by all means, ask us, and maybe think about paying us, to give advice on how you can make this work. And I think all of that is different, is really interesting, because it's about how these conditions require changes of perspective and changes in perceived hierarchies, which I think is something that is worth thinking about, in that you would find expertise in areas which we're not trained to look at as, a white Western non-disabled person, for a woman, for example. I have had contact with people in other countries because I have work which is either cancelled or postponed, or which is now moving online. And there are lots of issues around the content of what was going to happen in the work that I was going to be doing, in Sweden or in Italy or wherever it was. That are those issues, the issues that had already been agreed, are they really relevant now? Are there things which are more important and more pressing that we need to be doing? What kinds of spaces should we be co-creating with people online? The better to enable us to start thinking about those issues. We all over the cultural sector, we experience busyness a lot. So what I was saying before about having time to think is not always easy. And doing that on your own can be really quite hard. Whereas if you're doing that with others, you can generate more ideas, you can support each other, you can shift the mood because you're doing that together. And maybe it's not so much about creating teaching spaces, but creating or co-creating working spaces of a different kind. So I've noticed that there are differences in terms of what I'm being asked to focus on. And for me, a big shift to online work, which is not the case of doing what you were going to do, but online. It's a completely different way of doing things. And I feel that I'm kind of on the nursery slopes, and I'm aware that I need a lot of support to be able to do that properly. And again, what's interesting about things shifting is that, generally speaking, the people I'm relying on to help me do that are much younger than I am.
So the question, who's the expert and where does the expertise lie?
Exactly.
In terms of education, development, teaching really shifts. Maybe two questions that are connected in what you have already said. The first thing, if you can give an example of a topic that no longer feels so relevant or so pressing, and what kind of question might that be replaced with on the content side? And then also in terms of creating these working spaces online. I know also from working with you that you're very put a strong emphasis on creating space for experiences, learning by doing things, by exchange. And that very strongly, I always find, is enhanced if people join in the same room and can do things together. So what ways have you found so far online to create experiences like that for learning, for exchange, for collaborating together?
Okay, so two things. One in terms of the content topics, and the other thing to do with the methods. I think what's happened is that almost everything that we had planned to look at in those sessions, all of that, it's like sweeping a load of crockery off the table. Because addressing those things would be like avoiding the elephant in the room, and it's a bloody big elephant. You know, it's an elephant of the size and scale that none of us have ever encountered before. So it's almost like everything is off the table, and there is this thing which is to do with the fact that life is not going to be the same. And in many respects, that's going to be a good thing. And it's going to be challenging. And we don't yet know what the future is going to look like. And again, you know, as I was saying at the beginning, there's a residual anxiety and a certain amount of stress that cultural management can be, even though it's a very gregarious kind of profession, it can be quite isolating. It can be quite isolated. So it's more a question of trying to create spaces where people who are involved in similar kinds of work can talk, and can talk in a safe space with a high degree of trust to talk about the things that perhaps it's not appropriate or possible to talk about with anybody else. And that, it seems to me, is the most important thing. So that the topic, we know what the topic is, right? So, you know, and that, it seems to me, is one of the most supportive things that we can do. As far as the methods are concerned, you're absolutely right that basing things on experiential learning is, I don't know how that translates, or if it does, or whether we need to redefine what we mean by experiential learning. You know, because there's things that people can do offline, and then there are other things that we're expecting people to do online, and it's probably some kind of blend. And it may be that the proportions in that blend are going to be different. But we don't know yet. And it's not going to be people like me who are going to be able to come up with those ways forward. It's going to be people in the generation after me or the 2 generations after me who are going to be able to do that. And I think it's a very good thing, because at some point, people who've been round the block a few times, and I would put myself in that category, need to get out of the way. You know, there comes a point where what you may have accumulated through your study, through your professional experience, whatever, can start to become a brake on people. And I do think that this is going to become an issue. You know, at what point should you get out of the way and not occupy the space that really needs to be occupied by people who are younger, who are savvy in completely different areas? You know, I think there's going to be a lot of us who are going to be asking that sort of question.
Which is a very interesting thing, also, like as in terms of self-reflection. At the same time, as part of a generation, not maybe 2, but 1 generation's younger.
Yeah.
I'd also, I mean, that there has been a tendency to devaluate the experience of professionals with a lot of experience in the past, particularly men. I mean, the old white man who always is mansplaining things is rightly so in many ways a figure for criticism. At the same time, there is something that people can learn. So there also might be the question, what gets lost if it's completely out of the way, that kind of experience, because I think there's also a tendency at this point to be very ahistoric in our way of dealing with the current situation. And losing out of sight that what might feel completely novel isn't that novel if you look at other areas, like you mentioned Palestine, or people who are used to isolation for other reasons, but also in terms of like having a longer lifespan and a longer outlook on things. So there might be a reason to get out of the way, but there might also be the question, what gets lost if that voices aren't heard at all anymore?
Well, I think there's an issue about the medium through which that voice is exercised. And I think probably what I'm implying is there needs to be a degree of humility, which isn't always present. And I think that would help. Approaching this with a degree of humility would be enormously helpful. But I think that you're right. There is an issue there in that what do you do with all the not necessarily older, but people who've got a different body of experience? What do you do with them? And in the cultural management field, what tends to happen is that they just fall off. They just stop, right? Which can be quite challenging for the people who've dropped off. But there is a lot of stuff that might be potentially useful. And cultural management is also a field, I would suggest, that one cultural management colleague described to me as corporate amnesia, in that there's a lot of experience in the field, which gets lost when those cultural managers drop off. They stop what they're doing. So I'm not just talking about academics and trainers and people, but cultural managers themselves, people in the cultural field. And it would be really interesting to think of ways in which all of that expertise, all of that stuff, which is if you're talking about practitioners, is in their heads. It's not written down. It emerges, by and large, in conversation with other people. Now, if there's a way of capturing that, then I think that would be really useful. It's at that level I think it's most important, is to get out all of that practice-based knowledge and expertise and those approaches, which it seems to me, as cultural management has developed as a field of academic study, we're in danger of losing that. We're in danger of there being a kind of fissure between the sorts of things that we've been focusing on in order to build the academic credibility of this area and what people are doing on the ground. And there's a lot of expertise on the ground. And I think we've got to move away from the idea that it's those who are engaged at an academic level whose job it is to then somehow tell people at the practice level what they should be doing. If there's no dialogue, there's no point, it seems to me. And dialogue is something which relies on you being of a comparable level with someone else.
Yeah, and that's where humility would come in again. And maybe that's
right.
That's the last question I would have for our conversation, to have like a brief last look at the topic of cultural leadership. And you did a lot of research on leadership. You're teaching cultural leadership. And if I look at least at the German context, traditional cultural leadership, if you think about the Intendant, the artistic director of a theater, for example, not necessarily as a figure of humility, but rather a figure of omniscience and omnipotence in a way. And it seems to me, if I look, for example, at what's happening right now, there's a loss of power from these positions because people move to their home offices and they can't be controlled as they could before. And what's happening is there's this huge dynamic now of new initiatives, organizations doing things online that they didn't dare to do before in the digital sphere. So it seems that this loss of power from the very up creates a freedom on the ground levels for new initiatives, for experimentation, for improvisation, which is very healthy and interesting to look at. And so my question is, how do you see cultural leadership develop right now? Do you share this impression that traditional forms of leadership are questioned more? And do you think this will stick, or where do you see this going?
Yeah. You see, the last bit of your question is really interesting because there is always the possibility that things will go back in certain respects because we're talking about power. If we're talking about leadership, people don't let go of that too easily. However, if you look at the ways in which the pandemic is being handled, that shows very clearly the downside of the single male leader and the idea that leadership is somehow the sum total of all of the things that they do or they believe or that they exhibit by way of qualities. If that is called into question, I mean, not those individuals, but that whole area is called into because it's very dominant, that idea that if there's a crisis, the real problem, you have to look to one person. And in actual fact, that's the opposite of what we should be doing. Because if you've got a wicked problem, as Keith Grint says, if you've got a wicked problem, it's something which is immune to the habitual ways of thinking about and doing things. And in order to address a wicked problem, you need to have lots of brains focusing on it. You need to have lots of different perspectives focusing on it, because the chances are if you do that, you stand a better chance of coming up with a wise solution, or you'll make sense of it in a way which is more meaningful, which is more viable. And I think if all of this can encourage us to make that kind of shift, then that would be enormously helpful. It calls for a different kind of approach to leadership, which is much more facilitative, which is much more shared, which is much more distributed. And that makes sense to do that. So it's about listening. It's about asking good questions. It's about staying with discomfort and dilemmas and paradoxes and all of those kinds of things. It's about experimenting, and you need lots of people involved in that. And if you think of leadership as the means by which a group of people of whatever size moves from here to here, there's a lot in the middle of all of that which the cultural sector, particularly at small scale, the cultural sector has a lot of expertise, and you've just been describing, initiatives popping up. That's not to downplay the very real risks that small organisations are facing now because they're hitting the wall. But the point is that the change, it seems to me, is going to start at small scale level, like a raft or a dinghy level, not at the level of a tanker or an ocean liner, because they're much more difficult to move. And there are lots of vested interests in those sorts of organisations. So they're not going to be manoeuvrable like small-scale initiatives will be. And people in small-scale organisations are very used to living with uncertainty.
Which is another of those competencies that are so desperately needed right now.
Exactly. Yeah. They do it all the time when they're making work. So it's not surprising that kind of shifts to the way in which they operate. And that, it seems to me, is where I want to give a kind of shout out to the small scale, because that's the majority of cultural organisations and cultural initiatives, not the big ones. So I think there's a lot of really good work and really good ideas, which if those organisations have the space and have a measure of resourcing, they are going to be able to make a significant difference, it seems to me, in this new world that is going to follow.
Which would be definitely part of the good things that could come out of this.
I think so. Absolutely. You see, it's not the case that small organisations very often, it's not just that very often they're at the cutting edge of new work. They're also, because they have to be, very often at the cutting edge of the way in which things might be done. And I think the way in which things might be done is an area of expertise which is underexplored. And I think we would all benefit from more attention being paid to that.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to revisit that question in a few weeks' time together with you and see how these things have developed and whether there is a tendency that this might spread from the small to the bigger organizations in the next months to come. For today, I think we have got to come to an end. And so the last question is, where do you find inspiration? You mentioned the anxiety that you're feeling right now, and also that you've got more time than you're used to. So is there anything you can recommend to our listeners, be it as a digital resource or just a good book you're reading or music you're hearing that inspires you and gives you some calm in the current moment?
Yeah. The National Centre for Early Music in the UK has been sharing concerts that it's possible to watch all together. So even though we're not all in the same space, they broadcast things, I found that really good. I am reading The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. Hilary Mantel is a brilliant novelist, and this is the third part of a trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, who worked for Henry VIII. And I need that because it takes me away rather than necessarily focusing me on things and it's 700 pages, so it's taking me a while to get through it. The other thing is that I have a subscription to a magazine called The New Statesman. It's been going for a long time, which is why it has such an antiquated title. And that is something which is available online. And in terms of thinking about global issues, and we are experiencing a global pandemic, I'm finding that really, really useful as a source of ideas, as things that I can then think about when I'm on my daily walk, which is another source of inspiration, in that I'm very lucky I'm not cooped up in a small flat with lots of small children. I don't live in a city. I live in the countryside, which means that I can go walking. And there's something about the speed at which you walk and the speed at which you think. And there has been research around that. So when I start to get snarled up or confused, that's the time to go for a walk and approach things at a different kind of space. So, yes, there is one issue which I'm focusing on at the moment, which is the issue, which is the fact that normal is a ridiculous idea now. And I would like to, alongside everybody else in the sector, I would like to be part of the thinking and the doing that follows from this. Because we've got this one opportunity and we mustn't blow it. Because otherwise things will go back to how they were with a few tweaks, and that's not good enough. That's not good enough.
That's a very strong message to end this with. Thank you very much, Sue, for this conversation. And I'm looking forward to revisiting this question of the new in a few weeks' time with you on this podcast. So, thank you very much.
My pleasure. It was very interesting to think about it, really.
And this is the end of today's edition of our podcast, Wie geht's? The cultural sphere during the coronavirus crisis. Over the next few days, we will again have a number of German editions, and what a week this will continue to be. Tomorrow, I will be talking to Julia Hagen, a rising star as a young cello player from Austria, who moves many people with her regular musical contributions on Twitter. I'm really looking forward to our next editions. Take care. Bis bald, passen Sie gut auf sich auf.